this video is sponsored by me because I've got memberships now. So, won't hang on about it too long, but I'll just get the sales pitch out of the way. If you buy me a bottle of Lucozade, you'll get badges and custom emojis. You'll also get your name in the credits, and I'll be doing members-only polls about future video topics, both DSP and non-DSP related, and you get to vote on them. But if you buy me a bottle of Lucozade and a pack of Dreamies, not only do you make it easier for me to give Gypsy her medicine, but you'll also get access to the previous levels perks, as well as an actual shout-out during the credits, and you'll get videos a week early as well. I'm thinking about doing sort of members-only videos, but I'm not really sure how reliably I could do them, given how long it takes me to get regular videos out. Did think about things like Q&As, and I had an idea for defending my terrible taste, where I talk about how things like Black Metal and Alien 3 and the things that I like that are shit aren't actually that bad. But again, not really sure like how quickly I could get them out to make it seem worth it as a member. So anyway, yeah, there's room for improvement. I can workshop these things. I'll figure something out. But anyway, yeah, that's it. That's it. Sales pitch over. On with the video. If you trace back the roots of survival horror, you'll typically come away with three titles: 1989's Sweet Home, 1992's Alone in the Dark, and 1996's Resident Evil. However, if you ask me, not that anybody did, but I need a way to bridge this opening into the rest of the video, so I'm going to continue as if somebody has, then survival horror's big three should actually be a big four, and the fourth game in this sequence, pretty much the Anthrax of the group, is D. Developed by Warp and published on the 3DO by Panasonic, D, or Dino Shokotaku if you want to get all original Japanese title about this, was released in 1995 on the 3DO, with Acclaim publishing ports for the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation later that year, a PC release in 1996, and eventually a re-release by PC gaming Necromancer's Night Dive Studios in 2016. Director Kenji Eno was worried that the game's horror themes, which we'll get to later, would see it refuse publication, so he deliberately submitted a clean version to the publishers late, knowing that they'd make him deliver a copy to the manufacturers himself as punishment, at which point he switched versions and delivered the uncut, explicit version instead. In fact, Eno was so worried about the reaction to some of the more graphic content that he even kept some scenes secret from other members of the development team. Despite his concerns, D would go on to sell over 1 million copies in Japan, and while I can't find much information about worldwide sales figures, the game sold well enough to result in two sort of sequels, Enemy Zero and D2, and still has a cult following today. D follows the story of Laura Harris, rushing to a Los Angeles hospital after being informed that her father, Dr. Richter Harris, has murdered a number of patients and barricaded himself inside along with a number of hostages. After discovering scenes of carnage and slaughter at the hospital, Laura finds herself transported to the dining room of a strange medieval castle and must solve puzzles and avoid deadly traps in order to reach her father and unlock the mystery behind his madness. Mechanically, D plays like a traditional point-and-click adventure game, with a few items Laura can pick up and use, as well as a compact mirror that can be used a limited number of times for clues to puzzles. However, D's most unique feature is the 2-hour time limit imposed on players. With no save or pause functions, failure to complete the game within this time limit, which players can track using a pocket watch in their inventory, sees the game ending regardless of how far the player has progressed. This time limit imbues the game with a sense of tension, as it's a pressure the player cannot relieve through in-game means. Survival horror games typically give players some way of combating or avoiding death, and therefore losing the game, such as weapons or a place to hide. But the only way to avoid losing the game in D is to keep moving forward. A state of anxiety permeates through the abstract rooms and corridors of D, so Laura never feels safe, and there are no moments of respite for players to catch their breath. You have to weigh up whether it's worth shaving a few minutes off your remaining time to recuperate, or to keep pressing on and hope you can get through the labyrinthine nightmare before you hit the 2-hour deadline. This is a pressure that is further amplified by the achingly slow pace that Laura walks at, with every measured step resonating around stone staircases and barren bedrooms, acting almost like their own clock, their deliberate pace in contrast to the tick-tock of actual seconds slipping away. In a paper titled The Psychology, Geography and Architecture of Horror, How Places Creep Us Out, Francis McAndrew explains how humans as a species have always had a set of characteristics they look for when looking for places to stay, such as how sheltered it is, how well it helps us observe our natural surroundings, how protected we are from predators, and so on. Through natural selection, those who found and stayed in places that satisfied this criteria, and more importantly, avoided places that didn't, were more likely to survive and have offspring, leading all the way to us today. Because of their genetic legacy, we still have a sense of which places satisfy our need for safety and which places don't, and subsequently many horror films are set in isolated locales such as run-down castles or ruined old houses in the middle of nowhere, or in places immediately fatal to us such as in space or underwater. Now, even though these places are often fictional, they still reflect qualities which make us feel uneasy, and one of D's most unsettling aspects is its location. The castle Laura finds herself in is built not by an architect, but constructed by the mind of a madman, where deadly traps and rotting corpses litter the rooms and hallways she must traverse in order to find her father, resulting in a layout that is absent any sort of architectural logic. It feels oddly claustrophobic, the sparse walls and barren rooms being a limitation of the available technology. That limitation also serves to give the castle a uniformity of texture and lighting that feels oppressive. The walls feel too close, corridors too tight, and there are few places open enough to really breathe. Other than a brief foray into the gardens to solve a puzzle, most of D takes place within the castle's walls, and the enclosed setting violates many of our preferred criteria for assessing the safety of spaces. There is no escape, the layout of the castle and location of traps is a mystery, puzzles frustrate our movement throughout, and no help will be coming to save us. Laura is in danger, she is imprisoned, and most importantly, she is isolated, and one of the best ways that D conveys these fears is through its lack of a traditional soundtrack. One of the most effective techniques that horror media uses to create fear is ambiguity, the careful use of mystery, letting our minds fill in the blanks. Mystery hides in the shadows, and when we're in a heightened state of anxiety, when our nervous system is fired up and we're in fight or flight mode, we process information from our senses differently. Sound is crucial at this point, as picking up the faintest rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig could be the difference between life and death, and unlike our eyesight, we can't close our ears to avoid having to experience something horrific. Horror media takes advantage of this through musical scores, punctuating more traditional soundtracks with sharp, jagged stings, such as the shower scene in Psycho, unnerving low frequencies, such as in Jaws, and even infrasound below our audible range to unsettle, as in Paranormal Activity, to really emphasize moments of terror. D uses brief musical movements to score cinematic moments, such as solving a puzzle or stumbling into a trap. However, the moment-to-moment gameplay, when the player is actually controlling Laura, is scored with ambient noise that is distorted and unsettling, and periods of silence rather than a soundtrack proper. There is no serene or calming music in the relative safety of a safe room to give the player a moment to rest and recuperate, nor tense or ominous music to warn in advance of an impending threat. Stripped of this emotional guidance, the player is constantly listening for anything that might break the silence, anything that might give warnings of danger or death, so a certain level of tension and anxiety is always maintained. For an example of how effective silence can be in terrifying an audience, let us consider how these 3 areas in Resident Evil are soundtracked. The first being the save room, a soft piece that doesn't swell or spike suddenly, but rather slowly drifts by, carried on a calm current of reassurance and respite. The second being this hallway, with both the soundtrack and the ambient noise of an approaching zombie serving to warn players of an impending threat and giving them advance notice that they will soon have to choose between fight or flight. And finally, this hallway, where all sound dies and the player is immediately suspicious because there are no audible cues to use to prepare for an advancing threat. The player has no choice but to press on into the unknown. Or you can do what I usually do to give myself more time to prepare, which is turn around and run back through the door and go, okay, you know it's coming, you can handle this. The absence of sound works with the unique pressures of D's time limit to bestow a distinctive sense of anxiety and fear. There is no musical guide through its hallways and corridors. Instead, there's an echoing ambience to each area that conveys a slightly different sensation of unease and gives each area its own feeling of identity. The ambience repeating also serves to remind the player of their looming deadline, ticking like a clock and marking the passage of time with every echo as players make their way through mostly silent areas. There's no traditional musical score to give each room its own sensation of threat. Instead, the absence of sound works to amplify the claustrophobia of the castle, reinforce our isolation, and increase our sense of vulnerability. We are stripped of our ability to detect potential danger from afar because we cannot hear beyond the castle's walls, and yet still we will strain to listen. We cannot avoid doing so, it is a natural response, so we are never truly settled or reassured, and there is always the strange sensation that some threat lurks just out of earshot.
Laura.
While the sound design has held up well and is still effective, graphically it's a different story. It's fair to say that D has not aged well visually, but having said that, you wouldn't call the Golem high definition either. The techniques used to make this back in the 1920s, everything from the way the sets were designed and built, the costumes and makeup used, to the physical technology used to film it, and even the visual language of cinema and how stories were told through the medium, have since been refined, reinvented, renewed, or replaced in incremental steps as time has passed, and the same has happened to D. The puzzles, in retrospect, aren't that obtuse or difficult, and the 2-hour time limit is actually pretty generous. The game's speedrun record is shorter than the length of this video. So mechanically D isn't a particularly challenging game either, but there's just no avoiding those visuals. 30 years ago they were D's selling point. To see them on home consoles was a huge deal at the time, but looking back on this with modern eyes is a difficult thing to do. However, getting past that graphical limitation is not impossible, and once you slip into the world of the game it's a surprisingly unsettling experience. I'd argue that the horror of D is retroactively enhanced by the relatively basic visuals, as the game feels sort of primal as a result, and absent some of the more modern techniques used to build fear and anxiety in the player, the threat of the game somehow feels like it can go from 1 to 100 instantly. There's a constant sensation that simply making the wrong decision can bring death immediately, and the relative simplicity of the visuals betray a jarringly graphic impact when it threatens that outcome.
Nah, I'm just kidding. That scene actually ends like this. But you can see the point I'm trying to make, right?
juddering unnaturalness also helps to amplify Dee's darker themes, and from this point on there will be story spoilers, so if you are feeling like you want to try this 30-year-old game called Turkey, this is your last chance to stop the video and uncover the mystery of Richter Harris's mass murder spree yourself. Otherwise, brace yourself, it's gonna get dark. Throughout the game there are hidden 4 glowing insects which each trigger a flashback should Laura interact with them, incrementally revealing more of the story as Laura recalls fragmented memories of a traumatic event, each a trippy sequence of vibrant colour and vivid, violent imagery, serving to break up the suffocating fear of the dull and dark castle. The story culminates with Richter revealing that he and Laura are the descendants of a long line of cannibalistic vampires, stretching back all the way to Lord Dracula.
Laura, in our veins flows the blood of Dracula. The time of change comes to all of his blood. It starts with lust for the strange. Then comes the desire for human flesh to make the change complete.
And the flashbacks Laura experienced were memories Richter had tried to erase from Laura's mind, memories of when she killed and ate her mother. Due to their family curse, Richter has become a vessel for the spirit of the Dark Lord Dracula, and is now about to ritualistically transform, and it's here where the multiple endings spread out before us. The player can choose to sacrifice Laura and allow Richter to fully transform after killing her, with the sound of him eating her flesh playing over the credits. However, earlier in the game, Laura picks up a flintlock pistol, and if the player selects it from their inventory, they can shoot Richter and stop the transformation, leaving him to die in Laura's arms.
Laura, you've ended it. Thank you. A little more, and the change would have been complete. Perhaps, as a doctor, I wanted to see how the transformation would affect me. But that was wrong. And now, I will end my life as a man of flesh and blood. Laura, thank you. I love you. My last wish is that...
If the player does this and has found all 4 insects, then the sound of a baby crying out plays after the credits, with the implication here being that Laura has gone on to have a child, and the family curse has carried on into another generation. Before we move on, there's one thing I have to get off my chest. At several points throughout D, this translucent apparition of Richter appears and implores Laura to go no further, to turn around and leave. And every time he appears, the scene begins with Laura looking around for the source of his voice, like this.
Laura. 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 This is your father. Laura, go back.
And this happens every single fucking time.
Laura. 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 What are you doing? Go back.
So it doesn't take long for you to feel like this.
Laura. Laura.
For fuck's sake, Laura! Look up!
Laura. Laura. Laura.
Which has the unfortunate effect of spoiling the atmosphere somewhat. It's something little that you should be able to put to one side for the sake of your immersion, but it happens just enough times to be annoying. It's not quite on the same level as the rotating room bit, because seriously, fuck that room. The player spends far too long in here, Kenji, but it is annoying nonetheless. Anyway, now that I've got that off my chest, we can carry on with the video. In Monsters, Demons and Psychopaths, Fernando Espy Forson writes about how the social contexts of the late 19th and early 20th century influenced horror writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker, and how directors in the new and burgeoning medium of cinema translated those themes into their adaptations. Common at the time were fears and suspicions of the emerging fields of science, psychology and psychiatry, reflected in the id versus superego conflict of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the asylum confinement of Dracula's fanatical servant R.M. Renfield, with Dracula himself, or Count Orlok if you want to get all Nosferatu about this, often serving as an allegory for death and plagues in a time when scientific understanding was still lacking. Obviously, Dracula is our main interest here, and Forson continues to examine how cinematic adaptations continue to use Dracula as a reflection of the anxieties of society as time progressed, with an erotic link to vampires being established early on, inviting analysis from Freudian and Jungian perspectives, to social changes, drug allegories, and personal growth from childhood to adolescence, as seen in later vampire-inspired novels and films such as Salem's Lot and The Lost Boys. More contemporaneously with D, 1992's Bram Stoker's Dracula and 1994's Interview with a Vampire showed vampires struggling against their animalistic, baser instincts, grappling with morality and trying to be better, seeking redemption for their sins, and even feeling love beyond a simple lust for blood. D thematically draws on influences from both classic and contemporary vampire media, but due to not only the restrictions placed upon it by the available technology and the then current narrative conventions of its format, but also its idiosyncratic 2-hour time limit, such themes aren't explored as deeply as they could have been, as they simply can't be. The storytelling mechanics of survival horror were primal, the genre itself barely existing in the first place, and D was taking steps into unknown territory in the same way filmmakers in the silent era were, trying to find ways to push their medium and examine darker narratives at a time when such a thing would be shocking to society. Remember, D was released only 3 years after Mortal Kombat. Such mature and morbid themes in video games were relatively rare, as video games were still in the midst of their mascot platformer era, and society still saw them mainly as a toy for children. And here's a game that features cannibalism, one of the most universal taboos across human societies, as a main plot point. The nature of the FMV format allowed Kenji Eno to draw on multiple cinematic themes, not just in terms of the narrative, but also in the cinematography of the cutscenes that the player triggers. And as an example of this, I'd like to use one of D's most infamous scares, the Iron Maiden room. No, not that Iron Maiden. Fine, whatever. Stupid joke anyway. The reveal builds tension by cutting from the player's perspective to a shot from inside the room as Laura opens the door. The focus is on her eyes as she looks from left to right before opening the door further and then recoiling in horror as the camera pans to reveal an impaled corpse. If this moment were to play out from Laura's perspective, and thus the perspective of the player, it would have been a jump scare as the door opened, sure, but the opportunity to have built more tension would have been lost, as the reveal would have been more immediate. We wouldn't have seen Laura's reaction as fear, and wouldn't have had that moment of anxiety, as we recognise it as fear, but have yet to see what caused such fear in her in the first place, and the change would have affected the tone of the game and the emotional response of the player. Eno used several filmmaking techniques throughout D in order to create a specific sense of fear in the player, a unique attempt to push video games beyond their still developing conventions, and one that was very deliberate. In an interview with the official Sega Saturn magazine, he says, "I prefer movies as a medium, not just the movie-going experience, but the art of films, the look and feel that they convey." And when asked about how much the trends of other market affects video game design and development, Eno responds, "I can see what factors would work in each market by looking at that culture's movies and cartoons. What I've tried to do with D and Enemy Zero is convey a feeling of terror, a fear of the unknown. All cultures, regardless of their beliefs, understand the concept of terror. It's a universal emotion." Even the instruction manual for D states, "The best way to play this game is from the very beginning to the last scene. Think of it as if it were an actual movie. For this reason, you have just 2 hours to solve the whole mystery. Once a movie begins, you cannot stop the movie to get a box of popcorn, so we did not include a save option. Please enjoy your movie-going experience. Please continue to try to solve the mystery of D until you are able to watch the whole movie and discover the best ending." The use of cinematic techniques is a crucial component of how D invokes its unique sense of fear. The horror of D is a sensation of constantly creeping dread, with occasional spikes of anxiety, rather than constant activation of the fight or flight response, or the stress of health and inventory management. The sensation of threat never reaches the heights of, say, Pyramid Head or Nemesis, but D isn't trying to induce that sensation of horror in the player, because those conventions of survival horror weren't as fully established. Much like how M.R. James doesn't scare the reader in the same way as H.P. Lovecraft did, who doesn't scare the reader in the same way as Stephen King did, D works within a more nascent genre to induce a specific sensation of fear at a time when few games could, and the result is different from the feelings of fear that survival horror games from 3 or 4 console generations later can invoke. Not every technique is successful, not every attempt to scare the player establishes a precedent that future games will build upon, but a surprising amount of them do. D even has quick-time events during an encounter with a walking suit of armour. Quick-time events in 1995! In much the same way as the works of M.R. James or Edgar Allan Poe can still scare a reader, despite the fluidity of language compelling the evolution of narrative conventions, or how the psychological themes of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari can transcend the practical sets and costumes of 1920s Germany to unsettle and unnerve a modern viewer, Dee pushed the conventions of its contemporary genre and medium to create a sensation of fear and anxiety that few others were capable of providing at the time, a sensation that it is still successful at invoking in a modern player, despite how far game design has come in the 30 years since its release. Dee marries cinematic and gameplay conventions to create a sensation of terror in the player, in the same way that German expressionists used stylized sets and costume design and experimented with the visual language of cinema to scare the audience, both establishing foundations that would be built upon by future developers and directors looking to improve and refine their mechanics and conventions. Individual aspects can be broken down and found to be imperfect with the benefit of hindsight, but taken collectively and judged as the sum of its parts, Dee deserves to occupy a space in video game history that is equivalent to the place films such as Nosferatu occupy in the history of cinema. That is the silent horror of Dee. I haven't really mentioned the sequels because they're not really sequels per se. Laura was frequently referred to by Warp as a sort of digital actress, with the intention being that she would play different roles in different games, much like an actor would play different roles in different movies. And so while the three games are usually called the Dee trilogy, they're not strictly sequels because they're not really connected narratively to Dee. They're different characters in each story. Enemy Zero is heavily inspired by the Alien films, being set on a space station where Laura Lewis and her crew are being chased by an invisible enemy that the player has to track using sound. While D2 is more based around The Thing, it's set in the Canadian wilderness and sees Laura Parton surviving a plane crash and then discovering that other survivors have started to mutate into hideous plant-like monsters.
Looks like the nightmare isn't over. I'll take care of this.
Neither has any connection to the Laura Harris that carries Dracula's legacy in her veins. And while I could have done a video exploring how each of them helped contribute towards the survival horror genre, the purpose of this video was more to just focus on how Dee did that, at a time when the genre itself barely existed. Resident Evil released before Enemy Zero, and Silent Hill released before D2, so by that point the genre has started to sort of coalesce and conventions are starting to becoming a bit more solid, and ways and methods to manipulate the player's emotional responses were becoming a bit better understood. But Dee released at a time that's so early in the genre's life that it predates Clock Tower. Of course, that's not to suggest that there weren't games with horror themes before Dee. Obviously, Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark predate it, and you can even make the argument that 3D Monster Maze is the first real survival horror game. So there is precedent in terms of horror and video games, but most of them are just restricted by the technology available to them at the time. The level of graphical fidelity required to sort of more effectively immerse a player in a world to be able to effectively scare them was years or even decades away from most horror games. But Dee released at a time when that level of graphical fidelity was tantalisingly close, and with the use of some clever FMV trickery, some cinematic angles, unnerving sound design, and some rarely explored taboo themes, Dee managed to provide a disturbing and haunting experience that was unlike anything other available at the time, and I feel like it deserves to be recognised as a foundational entry in the genre of survival horror. Sadly, Kenji Eno passed away from heart failure on the 20th of February 2013. He was just 42 years old. Widely recognised as an auteur in the video game industry thanks to the experimental nature of Warp's output, Eno was a maverick who frequently caused a stir with his unconventional behaviour and his unique approach to the industry. He leaves behind a legacy of boundary-pushing creativity and innovation in game design.